and for the best aerospace era, this is Mansplaining. Here's the host, Anthony L. Seeley.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is the second part of my profile for the man known only as the chief designer. His name, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. If you have not listened to part 1, I encourage you to do so. It's the second episode of season 1. One thing I should have mentioned in part 1 is the name of the history professor who authorized my independent study on the space race back at Reinhardt University. This enabled me to receive my college credit for my history degree. His name, Dr. Jonathan Good. Now, let's get into how one man returned from the oblivion of a Siberian gulag to organizing and leading the first successful effort into one of mankind's prime aspirations. The first few years of the Cold War. The nuclear arms race was on. The U.S. possessed a superior air force that could deliver these devastating weapons to Moscow, just as it had against the Japanese Empire. Soviet leadership viewed this ominous threat with great intensity. The USSR needed a way to deliver their own warheads. The Soviets detonated their first nuclear device in August 1949, and a hydrogen device 4 years later. They had the bomb, but they had no viable way of getting this weapon past the superior U.S. Air Force. This is why the V-2 rocket was so intriguing to the Red Army. The Germans first used the V-2 rockets against Great Britain in September of 1944. This weapon was blistering fast and caused 2,754 deaths and 6,523 wounded in Great Britain. It also caused much fear because there was no defense against it. It was developed by Wernher von Braun and a team at the Peenemünde complex. The Red Army wanted to grab as much information and the German personnel involved with the project. Wernher von Braun and around 100 of his senior staff surrendered to U.S. forces in Project Paperclip, who were what was left. Korolev was one of the many experts that was sent into German territory occupied by the Red Army to find the spoils of war. The operation was disorganized, with multiple administrations and specialists in their respective fields vying for leadership. I want to share a thought that I have here. There were Russian POWs who worked at the Peenemünde complex providing technical work. I have not really found any evidence that any of them made their way back to join the Soviet ICBM and ultimately the space program, but this is a possibility. Red Army officers coerced remaining German technicians and scientists by guaranteeing that they'd be able to stay in Germany, and then forcibly transported them back to Russia. I've seen a documentary that shows Soviets getting the Germans drunk on vodka, and of course then throwing them in a van or a train car back to Russia. One of them was Helmut Guttrup, a senior technician involved with the V-2 production. Guttrup led a team of Germans with some Russian engineers to remake V-2 rockets and demonstrate its potential. After a successful launch, Guttrup proposed a two-stage rocket based on the V-2 that would increase its range. He wanted to prove that his team were the ones who should be tasked to create the first missile capable of delivering a payload anywhere on Earth. This effort rivaled Korolev's team. They also had to prove that they could re-engineer a V2 with a successful test launch. Korolev believed this was a waste of time. The German engineering was obsolete, and the missile was inaccurate. The results of the re-engineered V2s that were renamed the R1 backed this up with certainty. Korolev was devout in his belief that Soviet engineers could make a better rocket, and having two rival programs frustrated him greatly. Korolev won the favor of the Red Army, the Communist Party, and Joseph Stalin himself. This is thanks in part to Korolev's own persuasive ways. His design bureau, OKB-1, would be tasked to create a launch vehicle that could deliver a payload anywhere on Earth. The first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. Many changes happened in Korolev's personal world in the first few years of the Cold War. He was known to have relations, I will call it, outside of his marriage. He left his wife and married his new love interest, Nina Ivanova Kotikova, in 1948. She was much younger and worked as an English interpreter. The world landscape was also changing. The U.S. and its allies were making moves like the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. This appeared to threaten the sovereignty of Soviet Russia. The Communist Party also lost its leader, Joseph Stalin, on March 5, 1953. Nikita Khrushchev took power of the Communist Party that year. He was a very different sort of leader and had a very much different personality than his predecessor. During this time, Korolev had to study to officially join the Communist Party and fully clear his name from those prior false accusations that sent him to the Gulag in Kolyma. This would help his standing with the Communist Party so he could procure government support and funding in the form of rubles for one project or another. Now let's get on the road to the world's first ICBM and space launch vehicle. Yes, he was working to deliver to the Soviet military a delivery system to send a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. However, space was his real ambition. In my experience researching the highly secretive Soviet ICBM and space programs, it is easy to get lost in the many design bureaus that there were. You must keep in mind of how large of a project this was. The guidance systems, the rocket engines, the metal fabrication, the production of the reaction mass, construction of the launch site. This was on the scale of the Manhattan Project. Korolev's design bureau was OKB-1, although he was listed as the chief designer for many other design bureaus. So what was it like working under the chief designer? Grishka, an engineer at OKB-1 who later became a cosmonaut, said on meeting the chief designer in 1955. The first time I met Korolev, he asked me many questions. Where was I educated? What kind of lectures did I have at my institute? Why did I ask to work at OKB-1? What kind of books and theater did I like? He treated me like an equal. There was no sign in his manner that he was a giant. By the way, once NASA was organized, it employed thousands through the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. Many lived in Houston, Texas, and around Cape Canaveral, Florida. These workers made enough to live with their wives, kids, maybe a dog or two, in nice hot weather. This was not the case in the USSR. Korolev had to actually negotiate and procure living space for his workers at his design bureau. Imagine if your manager at your job had to find you a place to live. Here is another account from an engineer named Maximov, who was recruited by and worked under the chief designer in the early 1950s. He had this to say. Korolev's bureau was busy working on ballistic missiles, but Korolev himself was interested in the possibility of space exploration. I told him about my data on artificial satellites. I was young and emotional and had no idea who Korolev was. I said several times, "Do you understand?" Suddenly, I felt a kind of invisible wall. Korolev looked at me like a snorting bull and said, "I do understand everything." Korolev recruited talent from institutions and universities like Maximov and put them where they were needed and where they would succeed. Maximov had this to say on his experience working under the chief designer. He did not like people who tried to cover up their mistakes. He was a man of strong will, but he was very careful in choosing the technical means to solving problems. We had a lot of meetings with different organizations. Korolev sucked out the problem, looked at it from various sides, but after choosing the technical means, he became very decisive. Maximov also said Korolev had a tendency to, for punishment by shouting, swearing, it was not always justified. The next day he would see you and be embarrassed. He wouldn't apologize directly, but he would wordlessly convey his feelings with maybe a pat on the back. I don't think OKB1 had an HR department. He had a way of motivating the workforce and providing guidance when it was needed. Korolev and OKB1's efforts paid off after extensive development in secret, developing the first ICBM, the Semyorka, or R7, was successfully launched in 1957. This was a two-stage rocket that stood at a height of around 112 feet, depending on its payload. If you have not seen a picture or video of one, I encourage you to look it up. It is an awesome looking rocket. Now, on October 4th, 1957, under Korolev's direction, the R-7 launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik. Neither Khrushchev or President Eisenhower fully appreciated the implications at first. With global admiration and attention on the Communist Party, Khrushchev said on November 22, 1957, "Our missiles can be fitted with atomic and hydrogen warheads. Thus we proved our superiority in this area." Although this statement was not entirely accurate, in the US the reactions moved from shock to fear. This is why bomb shelters were built and why schools performed drills where kids practiced ducking under their desks. Not that that would make a difference. Khrushchev publicly boasted again on July 9th, 1958, "We shall erect an obelisk to the people who have created the rocket and the artificial Earth satellites. We shall inscribe their glorious names in gold to make them known to posterity for centuries. In due time. For their safety from hostile agents, he might be sent to destroy these outstanding people, we may not yet make them public, their names and their photographs. This is why Korolev's name fell into anonymity, and that's why he became known only as the chief designer years before. After all this boasting on the world stage for the communist way by Khrushchev, Korolev reportedly recounted that Khrushchev told him at a meeting in the Kremlin, "We never thought you would launch a Sputnik before the Americans, but you did it. Now please, launch something new in space for the next anniversary of our revolution." The anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution was in 1 month. This began a common and at times frustrating theme for Korolev in his career as a chief designer. Khrushchev and the Communist Party wanted Korolev to demonstrate their superiority through space achievements. This is not exclusive to the Soviets. We all remember John F. Kennedy famously declaring that we will land a man on the moon before this decade's out. Here's a question, though. These world leaders provided the support and money needed for the space programs. But they were not rocket engineers, and they should not be making deadlines and picking dates for missions only to further their own agendas, should they? You also have to wonder for Korolev, though. Did he fear that if he failed to deliver, could he be sent back to a gulag or worse? It had happened before. Either way, the number of Space First, Korolev, and OKB-1 personnel achieved was remarkable. Here is a short list for you. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, launched on October 4th, 1957. Sputnik 2, carrying Laika, the first dog in space, on November 3rd, 1957. This was the one Khrushchev wanted for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Luna 2, the first probe to impact the moon on September 12, 1959, a decade before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface. Vostok 1, launched on April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin, who Korolev personally picked for this very mission, was launched into orbit and became immortalized as the first man in space. Vostok 6, launched on June 16, 1963. The first woman in orbit, Valentina Tereshkova, was also picked by Korolev. Voskhod 1, launched on October 12, 1964. It carried 3 cosmonauts. I'm going to talk about this one here in a minute. Voskhod 2, launched on March 18, 1965. The first EVA. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first man to walk freely outside of a spacecraft in orbit. To everyone on the outside of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet space program appeared to be the preeminent authority on space. However, no one on the outside knew of the many failed launches in between. Soviet space launches were made in secret in a remote area in Kazakhstan near Baikonur, a far cry from NASA's launch in Florida open to the public eyes. Korolev appeared in a few pictures in the background with his cosmonauts, who became world famous. He is a very unassuming figure in the background, standing with other personnel. He did not dress in a suit and tie, but rather wore common but respectable clothes that a man of the time would wear in Soviet Russia. He wore a long overcoat and a brimmed hat. Korolev appears stout, with a thick neck, square jaw, and black hair. He has a very serious demeanor. What you can see, though, is the drive behind his dark eyes. As I said before, there was a theme of Khrushchev and the Kremlin interfering with Korolev's work and timeline because they wanted space achievements that beat NASA. In 1964, the first launch of the Gemini program was imminent. The awesome Gemini spacecraft was equipped with 2 seats. According to Vasily Mishin, who was Korolev's second in command, said Khrushchev phoned Korolev and ordered the launch of 3 cosmonauts right away. OKB-1 did not have a spacecraft capable of doing this, at least not safely. There was a modified and improved version of the single-seat Vostok spacecraft in the works. Korolev tasked his engineers at OKB-1 to strip it down so that 3 men could fit. By the way, Korolev chose the shape of the Vostok not because it was the simplest or the best, but because he thought it was an elegant shape. They were in the shape of a sphere. A Voxcod is really just a modified Vostok. One engineer on this project, named Konstantin Fyodkostov, suggested eliminating the conventional ejection system, in addition to having the cosmonauts fly without spacesuits. 3 could fit this way. Flying in orbit without a spacesuit is beyond negligent and borderline suicidal. After the work was complete, the spacecraft was renamed the Voskod. Fyodkostov recalled, "The final decision was made by Korolev, and he picked me to fly the mission." Imagine how that conversation went down. "So everything is ready, and you believe the Voskod will return the cosmonauts back to Earth safely?" "Yes, sir." "Good, because you're going on it." I wonder if Fyodkostov went back and checked a few things after this conversation. Korolev was more aware than anyone of how bad of an idea this mission was. However, he needed leverage for support on the N1L3 manned lunar project. I have read that Korolev, now in his 50s, could be seen sweating and his heart race the entire mission. The stress caused him to nearly faint after the 3 cramped cosmonauts returned safely. The once athletic Korolev, who excelled in swimming and gymnastics as a teenager back in Ukraine, was long gone. His time in the Kolyma Gulag and the long hours and stress of being the chief designer had taken its toll. In my opinion, Voskod 1 and Sputnik 2 should have never happened until they could have been performed safely. Interestingly, Nikita Khrushchev was ousted from leadership on October 14, 1964, the day after Voskod returned. Leonid Brezhnev became the Soviet leader later that year. I spoke to his work ethic in Part 1. The long hours, the endless meetings with Communist Party members and ministers, the competition with other bureaus for financial support, the insistence of space first from Khrushchev, and of course the space race against NASA. A Soviet general named Kamanin had this to say about Korolev. He spread himself too thin and tried to keep everything under his control. This explained his continual conflicts with Glushko and other chief designers. It was becoming too much to bear for the always exhausted Korolev, whose health continued to decline. He was achieving his ultimate dream of exploring space, but a man can only run on adrenaline for so long. His heart was very weak, although none of his colleagues knew this. He was known to say at OKB1, "I will die right here at this desk." In late 1965, however, Korolev said to a colleague at OKB1, "I'll just reach 60, and that's all. I will not stay here a day longer." This statement was very out of character for the chief designer, who never called in sick and was always working late. On January 14th, 1966, Korolev was forced to call in sick. He was scheduled to have minor surgery that would only keep him out 3 or 4 days. Korolev had a big undertaking waiting for him when he got back, because he finally got the go-ahead for the N1L3 lunar project. During the routine operation, Korolev began to bleed out. A massive cancerous tumor was found in his intestines. The physician, Pt2, spent 8 hours cutting the tumor out. After the tumor was removed, the medical staff was unable to revive him. Korolev's body and heart were too weak to recover. The chief designer was gone. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was only 59 years old. On January 17th, 1966, at the Hall of Commons of the House of Unions in Moscow, a massive ceremonial funeral took place. Only heroes of the Communist Party in the USSR were honored in this way. The world watched behind the Iron Curtain into the highly secretive nation. Who was this person of high status? Who had just died? There was a hint. The honor guard included world-famous cosmonauts like Yuri Gagarin, Valentina Tereshkova, and Pavel Pavlovich. The world learned the name of the man who directed the Soviet space program, the chief designer himself, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. The urn with Korolev's ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall on the Red Square, a place not open to the public. He was a rare combination of engineer, rocket scientist, and master manager. He balanced more than one person should have ever had. Whereas in the US, we had NASA, whose administration handled the manned space missions. Then you had the CIA, who worked on spy satellites. Then you had the US Army, Navy, Air Force, who worked on medium and long-range missiles. These are large government bureaucracies with committees and managers, not to mention all the government contractors involved with these projects. NASA employed over 400,000. They had better computers, electronics, and a more optimal launch location in Florida. Also, Washington spent far more on its space programs than Moscow. Korolev had his eyes, in some cases his hands, on most such projects involving rocket engines, ICBMs, guidance systems, satellites, manned spacecrafts, you name it. From the beginning of our existence, we have dreamed of reaching the heavens in the night sky. Korolev's relentless drive conquered the heavens first and made the space age a reality. I will be mentioning Korolev many more times here on Mansplaining in the future episodes. The story of Korolev's life is incredible. Here's a man who was falsely accused of treason by the NKVD and then sent to a Siberian gulag to only return and become the preeminent authority on the first successful space program in mankind's history. If you want to learn more about the man and the great accomplishments he orchestrated, then I suggest you read these two books. Korolev by James Halford, and the other, Sputnik in the Soviet Space Challenge by Asif Siddiqui. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, there's always a light at the end of the runway.
Follow Mansplaining for more stories from the best aerospace era, or go to bestaerospaceera.com or find us on social media.